It's great to see so many colleagues here together on a Tuesday evening. So welcome to meeting number 78 of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to study the question of privilege related to the campaign against the member for Wellington, Halton Hills, and other members. We have with us today Mr. Wesley Wark, Senior Fellow, Centre for International Governance Innovation, based in the Waterloo region, so the City of Waterloo, and at which I am a proud member of Parliament for, so yes, full disclosure. And we have with us Thomas Junot, Associate Professor, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, the University of Ottawa. You will each have 5 minutes for an opening statement, which I understand has been shared with interpreters, and then we will proceed to questions from committee members. And I would like to remind all members and witnesses that care must be taken with regard to earpieces for interpretations. Please be mindful to not place your earpiece near the microphone, as this can result in feedback loop, which may cause acoustic shock, which could in turn cause injury to the interpreters. So your earpiece, which would be attached to the device in front of you, to not put it near the microphone, but to keep it away, just to ensure that we minimize risks to the individuals who are helping us operate in both official languages. With that, Mr. Wark, the floor is yours. Welcome to Procedure and House Affairs.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, thank you for this invitation to appear. In this brief opening statement, I want to address 3 issues. To begin, I want to support the call by the Member of Parliament, Michael Chong, for change to strengthen the Canadian national security and intelligence system. That call has been echoed in the first report from the Special Rapporteur, David Johnston, who described the mishandling of intelligence with regard to known threats to Mr. Chong as, and I quote, certainly the most prominent, if not the only, example of poor information flow and processing between agencies, the public service, and ministers. Mr. Johnston's analysis, as you know, will be open to critique by those who are able to read his classified annex, including the review bodies. This issue will also be taken up in the public hearings that Mr. Johnston has planned, which I regard as an important opportunity to come up with fresh ideas for reforming Canadian intelligence. As we consider necessary changes to the machinery of government to ensure better intelligence flows, we must also look more broadly to the performance of what is often called the intelligence cycle, which includes intelligence collection, analysis, and reporting. Improving the machinery of government alone will not fix deficiencies in this broader intelligence cycle or produce change to what is often referred to as a deficient culture of intelligence in the federal government. Secondly, Mr. Chong, in his testimony before this committee, spoke of action taken by the British Security Service, MI5, in 2022 to alert the UK Parliament to the activities of a British lawyer of Chinese descent named Christine Lee, who was identified by MI5 as a Chinese agent of influence. Such actions by British intelligence are extremely rare. CSIS has available powers under statute known as threat reduction measures to use against identified actors engaged in foreign interference, and can deploy such measures even against the so-called sensitive sectors, including the political arena long identified in CSIS policy. But any practice of using threat reduction measures to publicly name and shame individuals, while potentially effective, must be guarded against abuse. We have only to recall the infamous case of a highly respected Canadian diplomat, E. Herbert Norman, who was driven to commit suicide by a relentless McCarthyite campaign against him that falsely accused him of being a communist agent of influence. Thirdly, I want to draw your attention to the ministerial directive issued on May 16th by the Public Safety Minister in response to the Michael Chong case. That directive emphasizes the need for CSIS to investigate, and I quote, all threats to the security of Canada that target Parliament and parliamentarians, end of quote, and to ensure whenever possible that parliamentarians are informed about such threats directly. It also requires that CSIS will inform the Minister of Public Safety about such threats in a timely manner. While this is an appropriate expression of ministerial accountability, I just want to register a hypothetical concern about the potential politicization of intelligence if a minister in any future government gets too drawn into a decision-making role in such matters. At the political level, it would also be important to ensure that the Prime Minister is similarly apprised of any such threat reporting, even if this is not spelled out explicitly in the ministerial directive. And at the senior public service level, a dual key system, with the second key being held by the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, might be worth considering. A final note on intelligence challenges in terms of dealing with foreign interference, which I think is not well captured in most media reporting. Intelligence has to understand threat actor intentions, capabilities, and opportunities. These are all distinct elements and intentions which can be captured, for example, in communications among Chinese consular officials, do not always translate into capabilities on the ground. Monitoring opportunities for interference operations is also important for timely intelligence. Without timely intelligence, the effort is wasted. Thank you for this opportunity. I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Professor Wark. Professor Junot, welcome to PROC.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back to talk to the committee again. Last time I was here 3 weeks ago, my focus was on how transparency should be better used as a tool to counter foreign interference. Today, I want to continue in the same direction and focus on other reforms to the intelligence community that could help better counter foreign interference. I want to address issues directly related to what happened to Mr. Chong and more broadly to some of the structural problems in the national security apparatus as highlighted in David Johnston's first report. My recommendations are broadly based on two sources, a book that I co-authored recently with Professor Stephanie Carvin from Carleton on intelligence policy dynamics in Canada. This book was based on 70 interviews with officials in the national security world, and a report that I co-authored with Vincent Rigby, a former national security and intelligence advisor to the PM, with the support of a task force of a dozen retired senior officials, including CSIS directors, other NSIAs, and deputy ministers. So my first recommendation would be the creation of a cabinet committee on national security. We need sustained attention at the political level on national security issues. This is essential to approach national security issues in a more proactive and strategic way. The current system encourages a much more ad hoc and reactive approach. A National Security Committee of Cabinet would need stronger bureaucratic support. That can only come through a stronger National Security and Intelligence Advisor position. More generally, I think the National Security Committee suffers from a lack of coordination. To be clear, this is not about individuals in specific positions. It is the architecture of the system that encourages silos and prevents stronger coordination from the center. I would add that the policy capacity in Public Safety Canada, which also plays an important coordination role, is still too weak. If you look at the main threats that Canada faces today, including foreign interference, they all have to be countered by not just a whole of government effort, but a whole of society effort. And this cannot be done optimally without stronger coordination. One weakness in the community that has been glaring through recent events, our intelligence community suffers from weak policy literacy, and the policy side suffers from weak intelligence literacy, though I would say that there have been significant improvements in recent years. This means that the intelligence community is often poorly positioned to provide optimal support to policy and political clients because of its poor understanding of their work. The culture in the intelligence community is still too insular, too closed, too resistant to change. The reverse is also true. Consumers of intelligence in policy, in the bureaucracy, but also in politics, are not optimally positioned to ask for the right intelligence support. We've seen that very clearly in recent weeks, and then to know how to use it as part of their work. How to build better intelligence literacy and policy literacy is hard, but we could do some things better. Better training. Training in the intelligence community is often mediocre, and there is very little measurement of how the money is actually spent. Secondments and exchanges. We need far more staff movement between the policy and intelligence worlds to help break silos and foster mutual understanding. As I said 3 weeks ago, there is also an epidemic of overclassification, which remains a major obstacle to information sharing between clients and the intelligence world. Another major problem is human resources. There are major challenges in the national security community on recruitment, retention, morale, career paths. Security clearances face massive backlogs. These are complicated, frustrating issues to deal with, but the longer they are neglected, the worse the situation gets. And if we don't get the human capital foundation right, we will not be able to allow the reforms that we're proposing to succeed. Finally, and to conclude, there is a glaring need for a comprehensive national security review in this country. This is an exercise that is labor-intensive and bureaucratically very painful, but we have not had one since 2004. It is useful as a brainstorming exercise to consider options, develop options, to answer difficult questions about threats we face, about tools, about governance, about human resources. It signals to our allies that we take national security seriously, which is a signal we badly need to send right now. And maybe most important, and to conclude, a point that is often neglected in Ottawa, it would signal to Canadians that national security matters, it would help raise awareness, it would provoke a more informed debate. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. We're now going to start with 6-minute rounds, beginning with Mr. Berthold, followed by Mr. Fergus, and then Ms. Normandin, followed by Ms. Blaney. And as usual, all comments must be addressed through the chair. And because we have 2 official languages, we will just take the time to make sure that you're speaking a little more slowly so that everyone can hear what you're saying and understand. And so on that, Mr. Berthold, you have the floor.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you to Mr. Junot and Mr. Work for attending today. Mr. Junot, you referred to a backlog in terms of security clearance. Can you tell us what you know about that backlog or those delays? Well, I'm really not in a position to be able to answer because that information is not public. So I don't actually have any numbers to give you. But what I can tell you anecdotally, through the research that I've done and through my own experience when I was working in the Department of Defense and through my university students who are also trying to do internships or work as staff in government, through all those channels, it appears that the wait time is quite long. If you're thinking about, for example, top secret, sometimes it's more than a year or even up to 2 years. So that poses some major issues. First of all, it affects morale, but it also affects retention. If you have a young, talented person who wants to work in the intelligence community and gets a job through what can be a very long process and is then told, well, you'll have to wait another 6 or 12 months so that we can go through your security clearance application. Well, not everyone has the patience to do that. It makes people frustrated. And so this is a huge problem. And it's a problem that has been well known for years. Thank you, Mr. Junot. I just wanted to know if you had any numbers, because we don't have any either. But we will put the question if there's an opportunity for that. Now, Mr. Junot, since your last appearance, Mr. Johnston's report came out. And in Mr. Johnston's recommendations, he included that of not having a public inquiry because that couldn't be done without compromising any national intelligence. Do you agree? I agree partially. I think that a public inquiry could have been possible, despite the fact that a lot of that would have to be in camera. However, there are precedents. For example, in the Rouleau Commission, for example, and in the Artur case. Now, in this case, maybe there would be more examples of that, but findings can still be published. Now, what I think the more relevant argument is for not having a public inquiry is that there isn't necessarily a significant added value for that, given all the other processes that exist, this committee, NSICOP, and CIRA. So my argument would be different from that of Mr. Johnston. So those public hearings, then, that he's recommending, I think that can be useful. Well, how would it differ from these hearings in PROC? Well, first of all, it will be a less political context because it won't be elected representatives, and it will encourage or provoke debate. Now, will it have a major impact? Not necessarily. Well, as a specialist or as an expert, intelligence experts, how did you react when we heard that intelligence communities were communicating information, but the people who were supposed to receive it weren't particularly interested in it? Apparently, there were emails that were delivered. Is that not proof of incompetence? I wouldn't use that word. I would say perhaps it wasn't very sophisticated. Because, you know, when you're talking about incompetence, you're talking about individuals. I don't think individuals are incompetent, but the system isn't mature. And in the book that I co-authored with Mr. Carvin, we interviewed many, many people. And the reality is that the political concerns, the appetite for this kind of intelligence is rather small. Well, then that's serious. Because it's all very well to give all the resources you need to the intelligence community, but if that information just ends up in a black hole, people won't know about it. And you referred to politicians, but you know we are elected representatives and we have a major role to play. So you spoke to partisanship. However, partisanship is healthy in a democracy. Absolutely. I think that your work is absolutely necessary. So it's important to have hearings like these ones in PROC. But I'd like to get back to my question because we went off on a tangent. How is it that after all these years and all these studies, we are in a situation where a minister receives information that they can't access and people treat it as being normal? There's no investigation. There's nothing was done. Well, Mr. Carvin and myself did research, and that showed that the appetite on the part of the government is limited for this kind of information. I think it would be appropriate to acknowledge that there has been progress. The system is working better than it used to 10 or 20 years ago. There is some progress. However, they're starting. They had a very late start, so we aren't necessarily where we should be at. Thank you. This afternoon, we listened to Mr. O'Toole, and he corroborated the first article about Mr. Cooper in terms of the influence, in terms of attempts to influence the elections. And we had testimony from a member who had been informed by CSIS that there was systematic attempts to suppress votes. Do you not think that to analyze and look at this needs to be done as well as action? Because there's been very little action. Yes, I do. All right, my time is up. I will come back to you. Thank you very much.
C'est bon, c'était... Merci, Monsieur Juno. Maintenant, on va aller à Monsieur...
Thank you. Now we're going to move to Mr. Fergus. You have the floor.
Deux témoins aujourd'hui. J'ai eu le plaisir de lire les travaux de ces deux témoins.
Point of order.
I've read the work. One moment, please. We're just going to pause. I believe that interpretation is not coming through. I'll keep speaking. It is coming through. Yes, it's coming through. Mr. Fergus, you have the floor again, so start over, please. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I hope all is working. Now, what I was saying, Chair, was that I've read the work of Mr. Junot and Mr. Work. And obviously they are experts. Professor Juneau, in March, and once again this evening, you said this. You said that Canada has already done a lot to counter foreign intelligence, or foreign interference rather, but that we could do more. Could you tell us in 1 minute where we started from, where we are now, and what we need to do to be where we want to be in terms of countering foreign interference? Well, in 1 minute. First, Canada does do work to counter foreign interference. You know, I've heard people saying Canada's doing nothing. Whether it be the current or the previous government, I don't think that's true. But yes, absolutely, Canada has to do more. What should we do? Well, there are all those recommendations that I made in my presentation, but there should also be a registry of foreign agents. We spoke about this when I was here last time. That's something that should have been done some time ago. And here we are today. So we have to do more. We have to act cautiously, but we have to do something. And what I would add, to get this all into 1 minute, is this. We need to talk about this more publicly, generally speaking, along with the work of this committee, in other fora. Because over the years, what I've seen in my research is that the Canadian government is acting reactively when it comes to national security. So basically the government acts when there's pressure, when there's political or public pressure, but not necessarily because there was a threat. So the political pressure is there right now. In the past, we've seen small steps when there has been pressure. I think we'll see more progress in the future, but we'll have to see. Microphone, please. You're on mute.
Vous êtes en sourdine.
We've been using Zoom for almost 3 years, and I still forget to take myself off mute. Professor, you spoke about political, or rather foreign interference, but in general terms. Oftentimes, the debate focuses on China. Now, if I've understood your work correctly, you are also an expert with respect to Iran. Now, Iran has often been stated as being another important foreign actor. Could you please tell us what role they play? Could you tell us about the Iranian MO, for example, when it comes to foreign interference? And how does it differ from that of China? Well, I'm happy that you asked the question, because many experts have expressed concerns regarding the fact that the debate focuses mainly on China. Yes, China is the main source of foreign interference. They are the #1 threat, but they're not the only one. There is Iran, there is Russia. There are other countries that we consider friends. Turkey is a NATO ally, but there's foreign interference on a small scale, yes, but let's take Saudi Arabia. We reconciled with them last week. However, it's not only our adversaries. Now, in the case of Iran, the main way they interfere that I'm concerned about is transnational repression. So there is repression beyond their borders. So you see the Iranian regime exert pressure, cyber pressure, for example, or on individuals who are here on the ground in Canada. So they have people here who may blackmail others here. They may blackmail dissidents who are advocating for human rights and democracy in Iran. And they are often the victims of serious threats. Sometimes their families in Iran are threatened. And I speak to many of these people on a regular basis. They tell me that they feel neglected, forgotten, they feel vulnerable, and that the government is not doing enough for them. Microphone, please. Mr. Fergus, once again, you are on mute. Again, I'm sorry, it's a bad day, Chair. I hope that I'll have an opportunity to ask you more questions, but I would like to ask a question to Professor Wark.
You had written in a recent Substack posting that you really want to, you recognize you wouldn't have a lot of time to make a quick recommendation, but if there was one thing that you wanted to leave with this committee, would you please be able to get that on the record for us today?
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson, through you, Madam Chair. The one thing that I think is important above all, and a reason why I advocate for public hearings as opposed to a judicial inquiry, is that I think we face in Canada, and this echoes some of what my colleague and friend Thomas Junot had to say, we face in Canada a significant issue of a deficiency around what the CSIS director calls national security literacy. The public has a very important role to play in responding to and combating foreign interference, perhaps the most important play of all the actors at work in this. And it is vital that we try to raise that level of public understanding and education. There are all kinds of instruments through which that can be done, including a national security strategy, which, as Professor Junot has indicated, was last produced in 2004. But public hearings, with the kind of flexibility that they have, which is very different from a judicial inquiry, I think could really advance that conversation. So that would be my one key hope as we go forward.
Thank you. Madame Normandin.
Ms. Normandin, thank you, and thank you to both our witnesses. My questions are pretty much open questions, so either of you can answer. I'd like to address the intelligence culture. You both referred to that. I'd like to follow up on a discussion that we actually had this morning. You mentioned that people are working in silos. So there's the intelligence community with their expertise, but they don't necessarily what's happening with respect to politics, and vice versa. Do you think there should be a better framework for those people who are higher up politically? For example, the National Security Advisor. Do you think they should have specific qualifications when you are appointing someone at those higher levels?
Je vais commencer.
Well, I'll begin. No, I think this is an issue of literacy. When it comes to politics within the intelligence community, there's low literacy, but I think that has improved. But we're not where we should be. Now, in my remarks, I spoke about better training. There are gaps in that training, and there should be more exchange. There should be more rotations. There isn't enough. You also referred to promotions. Now, I didn't speak to this, but this is something I'm very interested in. You know, there's a limit to having too specific a qualification, because then you don't have enough flexibility to be able to appoint people. But one recommendation I've made under other circumstances is this. There should be more ambitious criteria, and there should be a diversity of experience when you want to be promoted, even starting at the lower levels, whether that's in the intelligence agencies like the RCMP or CSIS or CBSA. There are people who may be promoted up to, say, Director General or X4, X5, but some of these people have never worked elsewhere except in these agencies. And I think that's a huge problem. These are people who may have very good technical expertise, but they don't really know Ottawa. So my question had to do more with the opposite way. What about the people who are responsible for advice and policies? Should they not have better knowledge of what's happening in the intelligence community, but that there actually be benchmarks and that it be clear? Yes, it works both ways. And there is a way to amend promotion criteria so that if you want to become XE1 or 2 or 3, or if you want to be involved in security, that you have to have at least 3 years experience in the intelligence community. Mr. Wark, do you have something to say?
I'm delighted at the question through you, Madam Chair. I would say, first of all, to understand the problem of intelligence culture, I think we can put this plainly and simply, that a country only has an intelligence culture when its government and those who serve it and the public at large understand that intelligence, good intelligence, is vital for decision making, and they take it seriously. As Professor Junot, I think, indicated, that is not the case in Canada. We take it seriously only episodically, and Canada is frankly offside with all our Five Eyes partners, and I even include New Zealand in that basket, which is not a country we want to necessarily compare ourselves with in terms of national security capabilities and not taking intelligence seriously, not assuming that intelligence has to be part of any policy-making process. I'll just, you know, there are many ways, again, that question of seriousness can be addressed, and some of them have to do with machinery of government, and I think certainly a National Security Committee of Cabinet chaired by the Prime Minister will be one way to get there. But on the National Security Advisor, just briefly on that, the National Security Intelligence Advisor exercises his or her power through what is often called the power of persuasion. There have been suggestions in the past that this should have some statutory power behind it. I think that's open to argument. But what the National Security Intelligence Advisor absolutely needs in that office is someone with great seniority and great respect across the Government of Canada and with great knowledge of intelligence and national security. And unfortunately in Canada, that position has over the last several years been a bit of a revolving door. Some very good people have occupied the position for not nearly long enough. In the UK model, similar model in terms of an advisor to cabinet, it's understood that this is the last post that a senior civil servant will occupy. They're beyond influence. They're beyond concern about career progression. They are concerned with the national interest. And we, I think, have to frame the NSII job in that context. And certainly, I think both Professor Junot and I agree the National Security Intelligence Advisor has to have resources, has to have a staff. There's a skeleton staff in PCO that assists the National Security Intelligence Advisor. And it's not surprising in that context that pieces of intelligence can get missed. But there is a broader problem there because there is a vast flow of intelligence. Let's recognize that. The challenge is making sure that that intelligence is really good and that people understand that it has to be read. And I think there's a lot of work that Canada needs to do in that regard. So thank you.
Merci beaucoup. J'ai assez...
Thank you very much. I only have a few seconds left, but in terms of intelligence culture, perhaps it's has improved over the past few years, but Mr. Wark, given that you have held various positions under Martin and Harper, could you talk to me about any issues that we have today that they had then, or is there any difference?
Madam Chair, again, very interesting question. I would just reflect on my own experiences in the crafting of the national security strategy in 2004, providing advice as that strategy was being finalized, and also serving for 2 terms on what was then created as the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on national security. My experience with the national security strategy convinced me that this is an important instrument that a government needs to have as a roadmap for itself and as a vital piece of public education, both for Canadian public and also for our allies, to signal how Canada intends to deal with a range of identifiable national security threats. I always thought the idea of a Prime Minister's Advisory Council on National Security was, and I will be brief, Madam Chair, a very interesting experiment that didn't perhaps run as long and as far as it needed to do. But I'll end on those 2 points.
Thank you, Professor Wark. Mrs. Blaney.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you very much to the witnesses here today. It's already been really interesting. So I'm going to ask an open question for both of you. I think it's interesting. I heard in both of your interventions discussions about literacy, both on the public side and I would dare say the intelligence side, but also maybe just the MP side. So I guess, and you talked about a national security strategy and a whole of society effort. So those things all correlate to me, and I think that the discussions have become far too partisan and not really focusing on the core issue, which is how are we going to deal with this, and how do Canadians have trust in the systems that we have in place. So I guess what I'm curious about is how could a national security strategy help with engaging the public in a meaningful way around encouraging public literacy. Do MPs have to be part of that as well? Not, you talked about having a cabinet committee on security, but does it make sense to have a more broad component? I know that we have NSACOP, but we also heard testimony today saying more MPs should actually just be educated in this so that it can move towards a less partisan realm and more of addressing this key issue. So if you could answer that big and fun question, I would really appreciate it.
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. I would say it's an excellent one, and I think one we need to pay more attention to, particularly on the side of trying to provide opportunities for MPs, particularly newly elected MPs coming into a strange world, perhaps, of the House of Commons, or even coming into the Senate with some degree of formal education, which perhaps they're unlikely ever to have come across, about the nature of national security threats and intelligence responses to them. And I would extend that beyond MPs and senators to conclude their staff, which as you know better than I will, play an important role in providing advice to MPs. I think there's a lot of educational work that can be done there. But I also think it's the case that MPs, their staff, senators, need access to more and more readable, publicly available information relevant to Canada on national security and intelligence. And I think that is the one huge argument for a national security strategy. A national security strategy exists, and it exists among many of our Five Eyes partners, to do a number of things, principally to spell out the understood range of national security threats that a country faces. Secondly, to talk about the responses to those threats, both in terms of the response capability of government and how those responses fit into a kind of democratic framework for a society engaging with these threats. And so it can be a very vital public education tool, including for MPs and staff, but also it serves as a roadmap for the government itself, which is in the national security and intelligence realm, decentralized, siloed, and could use, frankly, some marching orders. And I would just remind members of this committee of some of the testimony that the National Security Intelligence Advisor, Jodie Thomas, gave to the Public Order Emergency Commission, where she referenced the fact that she found it difficult to pull together a government response from her level because of the absence of a framework national security strategy. So if we're looking for an example to make this something more than just a nice ask, I think it was demonstrated, frankly, during the government's efforts to respond to the Freedom Convoy. Thank you.
I fully agree. And the last point in my presentation today was encouraging that, or suggesting that one of the benefits of a national security strategy review would be raising public awareness with the public writ large. There are many ways to do that, in addition to just releasing the document called the strategy. Speeches, throughout the process and after the process on the strategy and the review by politicians, but also by senior public servants, the director of CSIS and others. Engagement and consultation with civil society, not something we do nearly as much as we should do. And when I say engagement, I mean real engagement. There's a tendency in the intelligence community when it engages with the media, civil society, academics, to view engagement as a bit of an opportunity to tick a box in bureaucratic terms. But there's a need for serious engagement as a two-way conversation with civil society group, Chinese Canadians when we're talking about foreign interference, Iranian Canadians as we discussed before, and so on. Engagement with the media is something that the national security community does not do well, does not do enough of, with the national media, but also with local and ethnic media, which is a really important way to get the message out, to raise awareness in specific communities. There's a need to really ramp up effort at that level. And the last point I'd say is that throughout, to really emphasize this point, the national security community does better today. There's a bit of a theme in what I'm saying, that there is an improvement over the last 10 years. I think that's absolutely true. But they still struggle to engage in a meaningful way. Too much engagement is viewed as the offloading of speaking points. Which is at best not very useful, and in some cases actually counterproductive, because it can be offensive. It can convince people that the engagement is not meaningful, and therefore reinforce suspicion and mistrust and so on. So yes, engagement throughout a national security review, accompanied with a serious effort to think about how to do meaningful engagement.
Well, and I think that's interesting, and I just have a few seconds. But I look at places like Finland that's doing a lot of active stuff in terms of education, all the way from like very young children into universities and colleges. And I'm just really curious about that process, because what I've heard even from one of the ministers is that's sort of a provincial jurisdiction, but these are issues of national security, and if we don't teach that literacy. So I'll come back to that when it's my turn again.
Thank you, Mrs. Blaney. Now we'll go into 5 minutes to Mr. Carey, followed by Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. This is not my usual committee, and I find the testimony very interesting. Mike Chong is a good friend of mine, and frankly, what happened to him, I think, is outrageous, and there's a real lack of credibility in the story that the government is putting forward. And I think it's causing a lot of distrust in our institutions. And Mr. Junot, I want to ask you a couple of questions. In your opening testimony, you said that, we need to create a cabinet committee. We need to build up this credibility, national security review. But it's really important that people at the top, Canadians have confidence in the people at the top. I was just curious, when you were hired at your university, it's a pretty important job that you have. Did they give you an email address?
Yeah.
They did. And because it's very important that people around you, your boss, your students communicate with you, how many days did it take you to figure out how that email address worked?
About 3 minutes.
It did, okay. Information about Mr. Chong was sent to the former Minister of Public Safety in May of 2021. And apparently the minister and his staff did not see that information because he didn't know his own login credentials to access these emails. I find that incredible. I was just wondering, how would that happen? Like, what do you make of that? You've worked in government. How can you explain that to the average Canadian, how that would work?
Well, to be frank, in narrow terms, the fact that the minister would not use his top secret email, I don't think is surprising, and I don't think is a problem. Ministers have staff who will manage email for them, especially on a highly classified system. You cannot have a top secret system in the minister's office, because then the whole minister's office becomes a top secret zone, which means that everything becomes extremely complicated. So,
but don't you think that if, this is public safety for the entire country, that the person in charge of that should at least know his login credentials, maybe not, whatever the system is, but people around him
yes,
should be responsible to inform him? Because I find this unbelievable that he says he didn't have access to those emails. And I find that you are sticking up for him here. I can criticize an individual, but I find that outrageous.
I'm not sticking up for the minister or for anybody else. I just think that in this or any other government, it is not for a minister to manage his or her own email. So that specific aspect of, especially on highly classified systems.
A top secret email, the guy at the top.
Sorry, I'm just going to pause real quick.
Sure.
We can just pause the time. Mr. Carey, I appreciate you being at committee tonight. It's always a privilege to have people come visit, because this, to me, is the place to be. But at this committee, one person speaks at a time, and we go back and forth, because the two official languages are of utmost importance, and it helps the work of the interpreters. So we keep eye contact with each other, and then we just give a turn to each other, but two people do not speak at the same time. With that, I will give the floor back to you, Mr. Carey, and this time was not taken away from your time.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to apologize. I was getting a little emotional about it. What do you make of the fact that it took the previous Minister of Public Safety 4 months to give CSIS the authority to monitor a politician they identified and who had long been on their radar? 4 months. Mr. Juneau, sure. Why don't we stay there?
I find that in the absence of more information, it's very difficult to come to a clear conclusion on that. It seems long. Based on what is out in public, it seems too long, but it's hard to say more specifically than that.
Yeah, Mr. Wark, do you have I'm curious what you think. Please explain it to the ordinary Canadian.
Madam Chair, I would simply say that my understanding is the committee is going to hear from the minister in question, Bill Blair, I think tomorrow. And obviously the question should be addressed to him. I would only note that Minister Blair publicly said that the Globe and Mail report alleging that that it took 4 months for this action to take place was in error. So perhaps he will clarify that. If I could come back to your previous question about trying to understand the kind of intelligence flows that come into ministers and their staff, I would just say two things. One is the intelligence flows are extremely voluminous, and there are multiple classified systems to handle different levels of classification. So it's not a simple system. It's not a matter of having our university email logins available to us and not forgetting them. I think that is a bit of a caricature of a complex reality. It's not to excuse the fact that the intelligence can get lost, and that is inexcusable. But I do want to draw attention to another issue, which is that, as best we know from media reporting, what is being discussed here, at least initially, was a 9-page intelligence assessment in which this component of a warning about the targeting of unnamed MPs was frankly buried in the middle. And that comes back to an important issue, which is that it is incumbent on intelligence agencies and those who frame their reports and their analysis to be very clear about what they think is significant information, because you cannot expect a minister or a staff or senior deputy minister in the government to read through 9 pages and say, aha, there was this vague reference in the middle of this report that I really should have paid attention to, but actually nobody asked me to do that. So I do think that there's a larger systemic issue here, which is not just governance, as Mr. Johnston indicates, but is larger than that, as I said, around intelligence cycle issues. Get the collection right, get the analysis right, get the reporting right, and raise the bar on culture issues. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks to both the witnesses for being here today. Really appreciate you appearing, and your expert testimony is greatly appreciated. I think I'll start with just by saying, in response to Mr. Kerry's comments, I'm friends with Han Dong, and on the flip side of this, you can see how allegations made in the media from a supposed leak, unverified, can damage irreparably someone's reputation. So I'll just state that at the outset, that I think, we have to look at this in a very balanced way and try to get to the actual facts. So I want to ask Mr. Work some comments about a public or judicial inquiry. This morning we heard from some witnesses that say a public inquiry is needed. I keep getting this sense that some members of the public think a judicial inquiry would air or vent all of these highly classified national security documents in public. But I don't think that that's true. I think vast amounts of intelligence would have to remain undisclosed and therefore secret, even within a public or judicial inquiry. Mr. Work, would you agree with that?
I would indeed. I mean, thank you for the question, and through you, Madam Chair. I would say that there are very significant secrecy protection issues involved in a judicial inquiry that might look specifically at intelligence operations and ongoing intelligence operations, which would be at the heart of any judicial inquiry specifically focused on Chinese foreign interference. But I also think it's important for the public to understand some other things about judicial inquiries. And I say that in the context of having been engaged in 3 of them over the past 2 decades. The Artur inquiry, dealing with matters to do with the treatment of Mr. Artur and the RCMP's involvement in that in particular, headed by Justice O'Connor, the Air India inquiry, headed by Justice Major, and most recently the Rouleau Commission, which looked into the Freedom Convoy, for which I wrote a paper on intelligence and took part in the policy roundtables. Judicial inquiries are a great thing. They're an important instrument, but they're not always fit for every purpose. And I think it is important for Canadians to understand that judicial inquiries are not designed to move at speed. Judicial inquiries take time. They're meant to take time. They're deep dives. They're surrounded by a judicial framework. They're quasi-judicial in nature in terms of their proceedings, with many parties potentially having standing and, as you know, being able to cross-examine witnesses.
Maybe just interject there, because I have limited time. Sure. And I want to ask you some specific questions. I was going to ask you, how long does one usually take? I think you've said in a recent article about 2 to 3 years. Is that correct?
2 to 3 years is probably an average. I've never tried to count it, Madam Chair. The MacDonald Commission, which established CSIS, took 5 years to come up with its recommendations.
So, and then do you think that from an expediency perspective, viewing what must be a strengthened intelligence system and response before the next election, whenever that time comes, that we really need a much faster process? Would you agree with that, Mr. Ward?
I would indeed, and I'll just keep my response to this brief through you, Madam Chair. If urgency is the issue, which I think it is, in terms of coming up with some measures to strengthen the government's response and improve Canadians' understanding, you will not get that through a judicial inquiry. So urgency plus transparency, I think, are the ingredients that can be delivered through public hearings.
Thank you. And I think recently in your article, you've stipulated what you think would be or should be the objectives of a public inquiry or judicial inquiry. I think you've said, and maybe I can just verify, increase public knowledge and understanding and improve the capacity of the Canadian intelligence system. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so recently you also said in the same article that judicial inquiries are not meant to be used as an instrument to continue a partisan political controversy. In your view, from your assessment of the current political climate and in relation to this topic, are the motives of the parties pushing for a public inquiry focused on the optimum objectives?
Mr. Turnbull, it strikes me as a leading question slightly, and I'll
question.
dodge it if you don't mind. I think we all agree that there are high passions raised by this issue, and partisan positions have been taken. That is perhaps inevitable in a democracy. I think there are many calls for a reduction to the partisanship around the issue of national security, which I think we would all like to see.
You agree with those calls?
I do.
Yes. Okay, good. And in terms of my final question, I'd just like to ask you, you've also said that public hearings, and I'll quote you, both objectives could be achieved more expeditiously, I believe, through public hearings. Can you say why, very quickly?
As you know, Mr. Johnston's mandate, and it was Mr. Johnston that came up with the idea of public hearings and took many of us, I think, by surprise with that idea. His mandate ends in October, and he has a limited amount of time to come up with recommendations, and is clearly, from his first report, going to rely extensively on those public hearings to give him guidance. And I think public hearings can call on a wide range of kind of interested actors across Canadian society and experts overseas to help him with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put on the record that Mr. Turnbull, you had 20 seconds less than the response that came to Mr. Carey, because I know that we want an additional round, so I'll try to complete that and provide that extra time. Not for you. With that, Madame Normandin, demi et demi.
2.5 minutes, Ms. Normandin. I have a question for both of you, but perhaps we'll start with Professor Wark. One of the reasons that was given to not go ahead with an independent public inquiry was the sensitive nature of the information. But this morning there are witnesses who told us that when you're talking about foreign interference, you're really speaking about low-hanging fruit. So it's less sensitive than, say, spying or things like that. So could you kind of give us, tell us what level of sensitivity or what level of sensitive nature we're talking about compared to other cases? And if too much weight is given to the issue of national security, is there not a risk of overclassifying information and then the public doesn't have access to enough information?
Madam Chair, thank you for the question. Again, just to begin by agreeing completely with my colleague Thomas Junot that there are systematic, persistent problems with overclassification. I don't think those are going to be solved solely through a focus on foreign interference issues. In terms of, and it's an important question around how, what is the level of sensitivity we're talking about in holding either a judicial inquiry or public hearings on foreign interference. It is, I think, has to be understood as extremely high. And I think it also has to be said that some of the media revelations based on leaked documents clearly compromise what are often called Canadian sources and methods. methods because they refer, among other things, to the contents of intercepted communications flowing between Chinese diplomatic officials in Canada. And there's only one way in which that material can be gathered. So there are sources and methods at stake, which is at the heart of the information you have to protect. It is also, I think, important to understand that you cannot hold a judicial inquiry into foreign interference without considering where the trends are going, what's ahead, what are the current operations, what are the current investigations, what are the challenges they face. Again, all of that would have to be protected by, I think, a very heavy and high curtain of secrecy. Now, public hearings are going to have to deal with that same issue of secrecy, but are not going to try and penetrate it, but they're going to try and get at the general issues. And I think that is the more valuable proposition for Canadians.
Très rapidement.
Very quickly, I absolutely agree with what Mr. Wark said, but I would repeat what I said in my opening remarks earlier and what I have stated in the media over the past few weeks. This issue of overclassifying information, I think, can be used against the holding of a public inquiry, and that's not very convincing to my mind. You can hold inquiries even if there is classified information involved. There is important information to be provided to the public. I think that the added value of an inquiry would be limited. So I think that the benefits are somewhat exaggerated, and it's underestimating what other venues there are. Thank you very much. Ms. Blaney.
Well, thank you. This is so interesting. But I will come back to the part that I was talking about, just around having the general public have a level of an awareness and literacy in terms of these issues. And I also want to just touch on the fact that I represent a rather large rural and remote riding. And one of the challenges, of course, is how do people get information? And I find that as local news providers are struggling for funding resources, more and more people are just going online and not necessarily having the ability to decipher what is fact and what is not fact. So just to go back to that, what kind of commitment do we need to have in this process around just educating the general public to have that ability and that literacy to take information in and process it? And how does that benefit our national security as a whole?
So I think that's a great question. That's a topic that I've been very interested in working on. For the last 3 years until last year, I co-chaired an advisory body for the intelligence community called the National Security Transparency Advisory Group. I stopped doing that role last summer. And one of the questions that we looked at a lot in our work in the Transparency Advisory Group was how to promote engagement with Canadians. So a lot of the points I mentioned, right, on the importance of sustained engagement, of meaningful two-way conversations, as opposed to just data dumps that happen far too often, are some of the questions that we looked at a lot and that I'm very interested in. Media engagement. I mentioned that a few minutes ago. I think it really bears repeating. The national security community at the political level, but also at the bureaucratic level, needs to engage much better, not just in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality with the media, national media, but local media. You mentioned how you are in a remote writing, with ethnic media to talk about foreign interference, speaking to members of the media, the frustration that they feel in dealing with the bureaucracy. And I'll stick to the intelligence side because I don't really know the rest. Days to get answers, or when they get answers that they get meaningless boilerplate speaking points. That is very counterproductive to national security, ultimately. I get it why in the short term bureaucracies do that, but it's counterproductive. And the reason why I think we need to think much more deeply about this is, as I mentioned, societal resilience is a first line of defense against foreign interference, economic espionage, cyber intrusions, and so on. So an educated population, with the media playing an important transmission belt role, is part of stronger national defenses. So it's deeply counterproductive not to do that.
Thank you. With a desire from committee members, we are going to do a quick question to the Conservatives, followed by the Liberals, to wrap up this round, and we'll see you on your way. Thank you so much. Mr. Small.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is to Mr. Wark. Madam Chair. I heard him say that we need a Security Council chaired by the Prime Minister here in Canada. Given how polarized Canada's become in the last 8 years, how do you think that would increase the trust by Canadians in our national security? Mr. Work, please.
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. Through you, I don't think any of us imagine that any particular change, institutional change to the machinery of government is going to necessarily solve that larger issue around trust and understanding of national security threats and responses. I think the benefit of a cabinet committee chaired by the Prime Minister is just, it speaks to that question of kind of raising the culture of intelligence within the federal government at the most senior level to ensure that there is a cabinet committee chaired by the Prime Minister seized by these kinds of issues and capable of looking ahead to threats that are on the horizon, as opposed to something like the Incident Response Group, which is a purely emergency committee that is reactive and short-term.
Madam Chair, thank you. One more question for Mr. Johnston. How productive can the hearings, sorry, Mr. Work, you spoke about the hearings by Mr. Johnston. How can those hearings be productive given the epidemic of overclassification mentioned by Mr. Juneau? Do you agree with Mr. Juneau that there's an epidemic of overclassification?
I do agree with my colleague, Professor Juneau, that overclassification is a problem, and it's not unique to Canada, but we certainly suffer from it. And one of the ideas contained for the agenda of public hearings that Mr. Johnston has proposed, as you'll know, is to tackle that declassification issue, to see if something could be done to include.
Thank you, Mr. Webb.
Thank you. Mr. Juneau, Professor Juneau, just because your name was said, do you want a quick 2 seconds? You're great. Excellent. Mr. Turnbull, less than 2 minutes to do whatever you can.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Juneau, I'd like to ask you just a couple of quick questions with a bit of a preamble. You mentioned architecture of the system, the coordination role. Mr. Johnston, in his report, talks about shortcomings in the way intelligence is communicated and processed. When we had Jenny Byrne come to PROC, despite there being 8 CSIS reports identifying foreign interference, she said that she wasn't really briefed on it. It wasn't basically a concern during the Harper era. We know that Mr. Fadden in 2010 passed information on to the then National Security and Intelligence Advisor. It was with regards to the provincial and municipal level foreign interference. PM Harper said he was unaware of it. So is it possible that these shortcomings in the intelligence system in terms of the way that communication is relayed up and down are long-standing problems that have persisted for quite some time?
Broadly speaking, without going into the details of specific issues, but broadly speaking, yes. I think that the neglect of national security and intelligence issues is years old. It's decades old. There is an overall trend. I think we did see clear improvements during the conservative years from 06 to 15 as a result of Afghanistan, for example. But the trend that I was describing of steady improvement starts before that, continues during the Harper years, and continues now.
Okay, great. And just last question. In terms of the public hearings that the Right Honourable David Johnston proposed, do you think that this topic of coordination, the architecture of the system, combined with the communication shortcomings that he's identified, would be a good topic? And what could we hope to achieve in a public hearing on that? I mean, you've talked about intelligence and policy literacy, and I'm wondering whether that's a topic worth digging into in a public hearing.
Short answer is absolutely yes. There is, as I mentioned briefly in my remarks at the beginning, a resistance to change within the national security community. And if public hearings can create an impetus, public pressure for change, pressure coming from the political level, I think that can only be a good thing.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Excellent. Thank you so much. With that, Professors Juneau and Warwick, we'd like to thank you for your time and attention today on behalf of PROC committee members. If there is anything else you'd like to share with committee members, please do not hesitate to let us know. Just send it to the clerk. We'll have it translated in both official languages and shared with members. Your insights and time are appreciated. And with that, we wish you a good rest of the day. For the purpose of committee members, we will suspend for a quick 2 minutes, and then we will have one of our witnesses in person, the other by video conference. We will do the sound check and be right back at it again. Thank you, and see you shortly. We have with us Ms. Margaret McQuaig Johnston, Senior Fellow, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and Institute of Science, Society and Policy, University of Ottawa. And from the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute, we have joining us again Mr. Peter German, Chair of the Advisory Committee by video conference. Each of you will have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement, and I will just remind members, if you are using an earpiece, it is best to keep it in your ear or away from the microphone. Excellent. With that, Ms. McQuaig Johnston, the floor is yours. Welcome to PROC.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm honored to speak about these critically important issues today. My own expertise is on China, but while I'm not an intelligence expert, I had top secret special access security clearance during much of my time in government. And I've seen many intelligence reports, and I've dealt extensively with CSE and CSIS over the years, always regarding issues related to China. Despite my name, I'm not related to the Right Honourable David Johnston, but I very much admired his work and contributions to Canada since we first served together on a task force in the 1990s. And when he was appointed as Special Rapporteur, I supported his appointment in the media, as I thought that among all Canadians, he would be one of the most concerned about the threats to our democracy posed by China. I was therefore extremely surprised and disappointed with his dismissal of an independent public inquiry. I've been very, very concerned with the extent to which the PRC has acted to compromise our electoral system, and I'm very grateful to the public servants who have risked their careers and personal freedom by speaking to media about these threats, which of course have brought us to these committee meetings and the report. I do not say that lightly. As a former senior assistant deputy minister, I know well the rules about keeping government documents secret. But without those leaks, we would still be oblivious. And their release has not caused the great harm to the Canadian interest that Mr. Johnston invoked. In rejecting the inquiry, he stated that, and I'll quote, "A public inquiry examining the leaked materials could not be undertaken in public given the sensitivity of the intelligence," unquote. Yet, in his report, he went on to do exactly that. He went on one by one through 12 specific intelligence allegations that had been reported in the media. In each case, he identified that he had reviewed the intelligence, who he had interviewed about it, in some cases what they had said, and then reported very specific findings. In some cases, he found that there had been irregularities tied to the PRC consulates. He reported what the Prime Minister, ministers, and others knew and didn't know. In some cases, he explained why the allegations did not have merit, or could be explained, or how there was not visible evidence of money changing hands in cases of illegal campaign donations. He did not address the about 10 additional leaks that appeared in the Globe and Mail, so we're left to assume that they did not require comment and are therefore accurate. All of this is excellent work on the part of Mr. Johnston. The results of his research and analysis are very clear. This is exactly what I was hoping for in this report. And given his thorough analysis, he has proven well how one can assess intelligence and speak about it publicly to ensure that we are clear on what happened. While I would dispute how easily he dismissed some of the allegations, I have no doubt that he used his best judgment, and we can thank him for that. It proves that it can be done. So I would pose the question, What about the additional cases of Chinese interference about which the media have not reported? Given the depth and breadth of its activities and the very large number of Chinese officials posted in Canada, I have no doubt there is much more about which we should be made aware. Without an independent public inquiry, we'll go back to being oblivious. What the Johnston report did not talk about, and what no one is talking about, is what are the consequences that China has seen for the many infringements of our democracy that they have already committed. So far, the consequences are one single official sent home to Beijing, and only because his specific name was released, along with his threats against Michael Chong and his family. I'm very concerned that in talking about the public hearings, Mr. Johnston announced that he would be hearing from the Chinese diaspora, the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Falun Gong, pro-democracy Hong Kongers, and human rights activists would be more targeted if they spoke in public hearings. And for what? They've called for many years for a single window for investigations and for a foreign agent registry, which are still not implemented. I hope that the government has now gotten the message that Canadians care about these issues, because they clearly do. Other countries are watching us too. We must do this properly so they can learn from us, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. McQueen-Johnson, and we look forward to your comments and answers. Mr. German, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for the invitation to return to the committee. I appeared in person on May the 11th. I was before the Fisheries Committee yesterday, and I would have remained other than I had an obligation here today. So I'm glad to be able to attend virtually. I do not have an opening statement because I provided one on the 11th, and I won't bore you with another. Save to say that by way of background, I'm a former Deputy Commissioner of the RCMP and of Correctional Service Canada. Our institute, the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute, is an NGO and located at the University of British Columbia. On May the 11th, I spoke about the possibility of a registry of foreign agents and some factors that the committee would want, or government would want to take into consideration when creating such a registry, principally around the issue of transparency. And I also talked about money laundering, which is really my area of specialization, and the issue about following the money. And I drew a parallel between dirty money entering the election process and dirty money being used for terrorism. It's really a case of what resources do we have, what tools do we have in order to investigate matters such as this. I've also had the benefit of listening to your previous two witnesses in the past hour, and am somewhat familiar with the conversation that took place. So thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. German. I'm sure you've been watching all of our PROC committee meetings with a lot of thoughts and commentary. So I'm sure it's not just the last couple hours, but like every single one. Welcome back. And we're going to look at a mechanism for our frequent members and visitors to PROC and how we reward you for providing us the time. We do appreciate it, and thank you for coming back. With that, we're going to start a 6-minute round. We will start with Mr. Berthold, suivi par Madame Sahota.
Followed by Ms. Sahota, and then Ms. Normandin and Ms. Blaney. Mr. Berthold, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. McQuaid-Johnston, can you hear? Yes? Good. I wanted to begin by thanking you for being so frank. You have confirmed that initially you agreed with the choice of the rapporteur, but that you disagreed with the recommendations. I was reading you on Twitter to be able to prepare what I was going to say, and you said that the Government of Canada should begin sending more diplomats home because of the regime's efforts to spread misinformation targeting MPs. So you tweeted that today. And I wanted to make a connection to an article in the Globe and Mail on the May 12th that said that the CSIS had provided a list of diplomats whose expulsion should be considered because of their interference activities. So do you not think this is a huge gap then, a failing of the report to recommend that more diplomats be removed from the country or sent home?
One of the failings that I think it has, and it's a broader failing of the government to not act before this in taking action on the interference we've seen so far. And I am concerned about what's in the David Johnston report. I'm very concerned about the leaks, and I'm concerned about what else is going on. And talking to the diaspora, there are other things that are going on in the system as well. And so this is one of the few overt actions that the government can take to show its displeasure with what a country is doing.
Vous avez
You said something that struck me. We've been talking about interference and about MPs who are targeted by the regime, the Chinese regime. But you referred to the recommendation by Johnston to have public hearings, and you said that representatives of the diaspora may actually be made quite vulnerable if they were to participate in these public hearings. So we're not just talking about MPs who are targeted by that interference on the part of the Chinese party.
Sometimes the diaspora have given testimony behind closed doors to parliamentary committees. Often they've talked to government officials. There's something called the Canadian Coalition for Human Rights in China that is made up a body of the leaders of many of these diaspora groups. And what they have to reveal is shocking and very concerning as to how they and their families are treated, how they are threatened with their families back home. But to go public, as David Johnston wants them to do, would put them at further risk. And what we've seen is that when he talks about the public hearings, it's the diaspora that he puts front and center. In addition, he's talked about having people such as the intelligence and security experts that you've heard from today give testimony. And we've heard them in this forum. We've heard them in many forums. But I think it's more important to get to the root of what's actually happening in the parliamentary electoral interference and in the other systems of interference that they have in our society.
Pouvez-vous commenter sur le nombre?
Could you comment on the number of diplomats that Peking actually has in Canada now? Do you think Canada is too tolerant?
76 Chinese diplomats in Canada. China has 178 in the United States. So why are they paying so much attention to Canada? To a large extent, it's because we have a very large diaspora. 1.4 million Canadians have roots in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan as well. And so, you know, they are attempting to use the diaspora as an extension of what they call the motherland, having diaspora support the position that the Chinese government take on all kinds of issues, and certainly not do anything to undermine them. And so to the extent that they speak out against the threats that their families have had, or criticize regime politics and efforts, that can come back badly on them. So they need to be able to speak behind closed doors, which a public inquiry would allow.
I'd like to ask a question, but I don't want to put you in a difficult situation. How would a public inquiry differ from public hearings? In the report, he's suggesting public hearings. But there's very little trust on the part of the Canadian population, I believe, and even on the part of the Parliament. So do you think that would make a difference? And what would be the difference between a public inquiry and public hearings?
A public inquiry would be able to subpoena documents. It would be able to get much more intelligence from CSIS and CSE to analyze and assess what's going on in our society and to what extent Parliament needs to be informed and to what extent the public needs to be informed. They would then address that in a high level but very comprehensive report. My concern about the public hearings is that they would be seen to be superficial. They would hear from people like time.
Do you want to finish? They would hear from people like
you've been hearing from here, but not get into the very deep issues that CSIS and others have exposure to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just the beep, beep, beep that you'll hear will be the end of the round. If you are in process of rendering an answer, we'll just let you complete that thought for the purpose of the work that we're doing. So thank you for that. With that, we will now go to Mrs. Sahota.
As you know, we've been having these committee meetings for quite some time, so it's interesting, depending on the witness, we kind of go back and forth. Some things, like Mr. Johnston, the Right Honourable Mr. Johnston has also indicated, and many other witnesses here have stated a public inquiry is maybe the right way to go because certain things need to be in the public, and others have said, well, NSICOP and other forums are a good place to go because certain things need to be secret. And so now we are hearing that certain things need to be kept secret in camera at a public hearing. So there are many paths, I think, that could lead us to doing the work that's necessary to protect our democracy. I think that's what we're trying to get at. All of us are trying to figure out a way forward so that we can strengthen our institutions, make sure foreign interference is not as prevalent as we see today, and that is the outcome that we all want. So my question is to you, Ms. McQuaig-Johnston. After reading Mr. Johnston's report, it seems like you do agree with some of the outcomes or conclusions he's come to. Is there, I guess I should ask you, do you not see that perhaps his conclusions could possibly also reach a similar outcome that you would like to see in terms of strengthening our democracy? Could this not be a path that would still get us good outcomes?
It appears that from how he has expressed his public hearings to roll out is that he's looking for public commentators, professors, experts on national security who we've been hearing from. He wants to hear a lot from the diaspora. That's front and center. And this all in public hearings. And without the attempt to go into detailed CSIS documents and analyze what have not been in the leaks and what is there further that the Canadian public should be made aware of and that some action should be taken. He's also put the onus on the Canadian government for policy and governance solutions. And I think there's merit in those, but it takes the onus off the Chinese government to stop doing what they've been doing to our electoral system. And I think that's not going to be touched at all from what he has said. And that, I think, is where the public inquiry needs to go, to take a much deeper dive. We've seen the tip of the iceberg, but we now need to see what's in the water, to see what else is happening in our system. And it also goes to the importance of a National Security and Intelligence Committee of Cabinet, which I fully support, and I concur with my colleagues who were here earlier this evening. Chaired by the Prime Minister.
Sorry, but those are not the only, the public hearings are not the only things he's proposed. There is NSCOP, there are other institutions set up, panels set up, bodies that are going to be looking at this, so that the onus would still be on China, but to also educate Canadians is an important part. And I'm sure there's flexibility where if some Canadians felt that they couldn't come forward in a public manner, that something could be put forward for them so that the evidence could still be taken. So all is not for nothing. But I am wondering also, in my second question, what's so important, since you've been at deputy minister's level as well, and you said that you were taking in a lot of this type of information at that time, especially in particular to China. Do you think it is not important for, at this time in particular, for leaders of all parties to perhaps take the briefings that they can get, so that they too can become aware of the information that is out there? I know that you've made some comments and said that, even as the Right Honourable Mr. Johnston has disclosed some things without actually revealing intelligence secrets, discussions and commentary could still be made about the issue without disclosing those secrets, but it's still important to have a better understanding, come from a place of knowledge. Would you not say so?
I believe that more knowledge is always important. So yes, I would concur with that. And on NSICOP, Mr. Johnston talked about the high value of it, and I completely agree. I think David McGuinty has done a tremendous job, and the other committee members as well. But repeatedly, their very important recommendations have been ignored. And their reports prove, again, that a public inquiry can report on issues of national security. So, Mr. Johnston said that NSICOP can review his work and that they should report publicly if they reach a different conclusion. But they actually aren't allowed to do that unless the PM says that they can, and that would result in the PM saying that NSICOP has come to a different conclusion than his own Johnston report, which he has commended. So there are some disconnects there.
That's interesting. NSICOP regularly reports their findings in the manner in which they can. Mm-hmm. That's all my time for now, though. Thank you.
Do you want to finish that thought, Mrs. Sahota?
No, my follow-up was going to be a little bit longer than that. So
I appreciate that. Thank you. Madame Normandin.
Ms. Normandin. Thank you very much to both our witnesses. And I'm going to start with you, Ms. McQuaid-Johnston. I want to follow up on what my colleague, Mr. Berthold, asked you about public hearings and the fact that members of the diaspora who would testify could become targets themselves by Beijing. So if there were to be an independent public inquiry, that would be a safer way for them to testify, perhaps. I'd like to hear what you think about that. Would it be better to have that independent inquiry so that the diaspora can also provide information to whomever would be the head of that?
Have an opportunity to provide it in public if they want, or as far as they want to go, but also with the option for in-camera, and public inquiries normally would provide that option. And I think it's important for the intensity of the work that needs to be done, that it take place in a public inquiry. This is not an issue that we can address in the next 4 or 5 months. And it's going to take time to go through it in the amount of detail that it merits. Remember that this is an issue that has been the focus of Parliament, of this committee, the Canada-China Committee to a large extent. People like me, all kinds of experts are looking at these issues. And it's been all over the media. The public opinion polls show that Canadians are very concerned. You don't just have a few public meetings and say, okay, well, here are a couple of things that can be done in process and governance, and that's it. We need to get into the detail of the interference as China has been conducting it here in Canada.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Now, I have a question for both of you, but based on one of Ms. McQuaid-Johnston's premises. You said that there are a few cases of interference that we've seen reported in the media, but that there are probably others we are not aware of. Would an independent public, rather a public inquiry would allow us to become aware of that? So what I'd like to know is this. Given the revelations, do you think that the public would have enough confidence in Mr. Johnston's ability to lead a public inquiry, given his recommendations? Because I'm wondering if his appearance of neutrality has been compromised in a way, and perhaps that actually would prevent him from having that credibility with the public.
I can't comment on his neutrality. I know the points have been made by many politicians. I do know that he's looked at it for 2 months. He's not got a deep China experience or a deep security experience to bring to it. He's looked at it for 2 months, and in that 2 months he concluded that there should be public hearings of the diaspora. So he doesn't understand that diaspora would never want that. And so that suggests that he doesn't have that understanding of what's happening, the dynamic that's happening in the communities out there of Chinese Canadians.
Monsieur German,
Mr. German, given that it will still be Mr. Johnston, do you think that people trust him enough that they would want to come and testify before him?
Yeah, through the chair, thank you for the question. I'm really not prepared to comment on Mr. Johnston or what the public feels about him, but allow me to just comment on this issue of a public inquiry or not. We went through a very similar discussion in British Columbia after the dirty money reports that I authored. The public seemed to want a public inquiry on money laundering. And the question was, do we or don't we? And as your previous witnesses indicated, public inquiries are lengthy, and they're also, I would add, costly. But they do provide a mechanism by which the public can interact, can hear on a daily basis from witnesses and so forth. I certainly agree that protection of witnesses will be critical in any public inquiry or hearings, whether it involves China, Iran, Russia, you name it. People that are impacted by interference of one sort or another by a foreign government will need protection. And it's not as if there are certainly spokespersons that would be happy to, to appear in public, but many members of the diaspora, as we indicate, would not. I should also add that the Cullen Commission, which was eventually appointed in British Columbia to deal with the issue, Mr. Justice Cullen, actually held public hearings as part of his public inquiry. So he was able to combine both mechanisms, and he actually started with public hearings to hear from the public, anyone that really wanted to talk to him about money laundering at various forums around British Columbia. And then he got into the nitty-gritty of his work, reviewing documents, experts, etc. The big difference here, of course, is this issue of documents, classified documents. There are mechanisms to deal with that, as the previous witnesses have discussed. And there are provisions in our Canada Evidence Act. We do similar things in the Criminal Code. So there are ways of dealing with it, but it's not easy. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Nothing good seems to come easy, so we appreciate that. Mrs. Blaney.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I thank our witnesses for being here today to testify. This is a very complex issue, and I appreciate both witnesses for acknowledging how complex this is and the fact that there needs to be a lot of addressing of issues both within this atmosphere but also in the general public. Something that came up earlier in the testimony today was around building literacy for Canadians around addressing these issues and building that literacy so that as we're going down this path of really understanding what's happening in terms of foreign interference from multiple countries, acknowledging that it's an ever-changing and evolving reality that we have to collectively respond to in a meaningful way. I'm just wondering if both of you could share your thoughts on the importance of building that literacy for Canadians and how that would support national security in the long term. And if I could just start with Mr. Germain, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you for the question. Through the chair, I would start by saying don't underestimate the literacy of Canadians. It's no different than everybody has a vote, everybody has an opinion, and I suspect everybody will have an opinion on national security today in the population. Particularly people living in the particular diasporas that we're talking about. I live in Vancouver, Greater Vancouver. We have large Iranian and Chinese diasporas here. And I can assure you, people in those communities know full well about the implications of the issues that we're talking about here today. And they have positions one way or the other. So, you know, when we talk about education, I think we have to be fairly focused on what exactly we're talking about, what we're trying to accomplish, whether it be by way of an inquiry or hearings. And it gets back to this issue of protection. People are already quite familiar with these issues. Thank you.
Ms. McCaig-Johnston.
Yes, well, thank you. And I support that. And I think we've seen that the Canadian public has a lot of interest and a lot of concern about this. We see it in the public opinion polls. We see it in the fact that 72% of Canadians want a public inquiry. They want these issues aired. They're very concerned that the government is going to completely get on top of this and not leave it to some superficial kind of process. Further, I think there's a lot of merit to the literacy of Cabinet on these issues because we need a National Security Committee of Cabinet to have the Prime Minister and ministers around the table discussing these issues collectively on a regular basis with regular briefings by all of them, for all of them on CSIS-related intelligence. This is an issue, and this is important because they're going to be dealing in Cabinet with all the economic opportunities. There are also risks, and we're seeing the risks now in this interference. I attended Cabinet Committee meetings for 5 years every week. And the dynamic you see around the table is really important, and it's built over months and years of collaboration on these kinds of issues. And I think it's sad that we haven't had one up until now, and this is an opportunity to introduce one. There was a suggestion by Mr. Johnston that it would be a committee instead of the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, and I strongly disagree with that. It's both that we need.
That's really interesting. One of the things that has really impacted me is in doing this process, especially knowing that this is a question of privilege. Mr. Chong also brought up during his testimony the importance of the diaspora community and what they're facing in their everyday life, depending on their circumstance. So I guess my question is around a couple of things. One is there's been discussion about the foreign registry, and I think we've also heard from those communities that there's concern about that being done well and not increasing discrimination against particular communities in this country. But also the fact that it seems that people who come forward with concerns because they feel that they're being impacted by foreign interference are not able to actually get the support and the help that they need. So I'll leave that to you, Ms. McCaig-Johnston, to talk about your understanding of that, knowing that you don't speak for all of diaspora communities, but just the parts that you have been exposed to.
Thank you. This is a really important issue. I think I'm very encouraged by the signals that we're hearing from the government that there will be a registry. I think that's important. I've participated in the consultations. Personally, I think the registry should just focus on the countries that we think are a problem: China, Iran, and Russia, of course, and rather than having people from the Netherlands and the U.S. and others having to register. However, I don't believe that's the approach that will be taken, so that's fine. I think it's important that we have one. The reason I can give as an example, in New York City, the police. In New York City, the police were able to arrest a number of Chinese associated with the police station in New York City. And the reason is they had a registry. Those individuals were threatening people in the community, and they weren't registered, so they could be charged. We don't have that here. And you know, I think it would help the diaspora a lot if they knew that these people could be charged.
Thank you. With that, we'll go into our second round. We will start with Mr. Carey, followed by Mrs. Romanado. Mr. Carey, 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. German, I'd like to start with you. You're probably one of Canada's most credible experts on dirty money, so I'd like to talk to you about dirty money. We know Beijing likes to throw their money around. They throw it around for influence. We've heard stories of the past where politicians may accept Beijing cash for access fundraising or donations to foundations or pet projects, things along that line. But I think it's important that Canadians know where the money comes from. And I was wondering if you could explain how funneling of money works from Beijing. I'm reading Sam Cooper's book, Willful Blindness, and I think it should be mandatory reading for anybody who's interested in this particular topic. So I was wondering, could you tell the committee about what Sam Cooper coined in his book, Willful Blindness, as the Vancouver model? If you could explain that to us.
Well, thank you. And through the chair, the term Vancouver model actually comes from a professor in Australia who observed what was taking place in Vancouver, John Langdale. And I used that in the dirty money reports. And it was later accessed, and that's where Mr. Cooper comes up with it. But it speaks to the movement of money out of China, avoiding capital controls which exist in China. You can only take out the equivalent of $50,000 per year as an individual U.S. equivalent money out of China. So if people want to move money out, they have to find other ways of doing it. And the Vancouver model really was a situation in which underground bankers, and it's a bit complex to answer quickly, but underground bankers facilitated the movement of money out of China without the money physically moving. In fact, it was all done by way of electronic communications. When a person shows up in Vancouver, they would receive an equivalent sum minus a service charge and equivalent sum to what they had deposited with the underground bankers in China. But that is not to say that the state uses that method. That is what individuals were using because they wanted to move their money into a safe haven, i.e. Canada, or they wanted to use it for casino gambling or for any number of different reasons, investing. I don't know that we know how foreign states necessarily move their money, but the one thing I was urging the committee in the previous session that I spoke at is following the money is important. And in any process that's put in place, we have to keep that in mind. And enforcement agencies that are looking at a registry have to have the necessary expertise and resources to look at what we can call very broadly the money laundering aspect. How did the money get there? And most money can be traced back. It's only cash that's really difficult. Everything else can be traced in one way or another. You have to use other techniques to follow the cash. I don't know if that answers the question, but in a short period of time.
Maybe we'll just send the book out to everybody who's interested in it. But in the book, it talks about how, $20 bills become $100 bills funneled through casinos very systematically. And it doesn't seem that Beijing is really too interested in stopping it, that's for sure. And I have a question for you. How has Beijing and CCP affiliated organizations leveraged perhaps some of these illegal operations to further the goals of foreign interference in Canada, or can you see maybe a hypothesis of that? And moreover, what solid actions could counter that type of activity? What could we do as a government to counter that?
Right. So the move consolidating $20 bills into hundreds, there's actually a term for that. It's called refining, and that's common in the drug world. In terms of China, I've said before, and I believe it's in my reports, that China is very tough on drug crimes and organized crime within China. It's tough on numerous offenses, much tougher than we are, but not so in terms of its citizens or persons of Chinese ethnicity outside the country. So we seem to see a lot of organized crime outside China that has connections back to the home country. We see a lot of legitimate investment outside China, which might not be possible within China. And it would appear that the Chinese government has not taken exception to what is taking place outside its borders. And some might say that's appropriate. Why should they? So you really have a real difference between what takes place within and without.
Thank you. With that, we'll go to Madame Romanetto.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And through you, I'd like to thank the two witnesses for being with us this evening, and also to thank them both for their service to Canada in the various capacities that you've both held over the years. My first line of question, I'd like to start with Mr. German. And I want to talk to you a little bit about something we've been hearing over the course of the last couple of meetings with respect to not a clear understanding from politicians what intelligence is, and from the point of view of intelligence experts, what politics is like. So when I look through the Order of Council dated April 28, 2017, there were changes made to the National Security Advisor title then held by Daniel Jean to include intelligence. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that the federal election of 2015, we saw a change in posture with respect to understanding the importance of cybersecurity in terms of the importance of intelligence and what we were hearing with from our partners with Five Eyes. And I wanted to get a sense from you in that special rapporteur report. He mentions the Right Honourable Mr. Johnston mentions the need to improve the way information is shared between our security agencies and the government. Would you elaborate a little bit about the importance of them intelligence people understanding what we do for a living, and the importance of what we do understanding what intelligence community does?
And I'm sorry, are you directing that to me?
I am, Mr. German.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your kind comment at the beginning of your question. So we're surrounded by information, every one of us. It's information overload. Intelligence means something quite different than information. It is something that can be used for a purpose. Oftentimes we refer to actionable intelligence. The issue of politicians and understanding the intelligence community and the intelligence community understanding politicians, I would expand that to law enforcement understanding politicians. In my career, although I did work in an intelligence capacity for a while, it was primarily law enforcement. And we had to create those barriers between politics and law enforcement. We had to do our job regardless of whether it ended up favoring one political party or another. And I'm thinking here about corruption investigations. So I think the police in this country understand that. I don't think that's a big issue. And I think politicians, quite frankly, understand it. When there's a law enforcement investigation, we do not see interference by politicians. That's very unusual. In the other direction, though, I can understand why, and we heard that from the previous speakers as well as my a colleague on the panel right now, that it's important that politicians, members of parliament, and so forth, be aware of the intelligence apparatus and what they can learn from it, what that intelligence community is intended to do. Because really, at the end of the day, the intelligence community is there to serve Canadians. And if it's not providing you with the information you need, then I guess we've got a problem.
So in that vein, so I used to sit on the National Defense Committee. I was Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defense, to the Minister of Veteran Affairs, Associate Minister of National Defense. I have a son who's an intelligence officer with the Canadian Armed Forces. I've been to NORAD Cheyenne Mountain. I have been to, NORAD North, and I understand fully. And I have received various intelligence briefings, and I understand fully the importance of understanding that we're getting little parts of it. We will not get the full picture, especially if we do not have necessary clearance. So in that regard, you're asking that politicians learn more and more about and understand intelligence. And if the offer is there for leaders of political parties to receive necessary clearance and receive these intelligence briefings to see for themselves the information that the rapporteur was able to glean from his 2 months investigation, would you not recommend that all politicians who are offered this kind of briefing not avail themselves of this?
That quickly gets you into this issue of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. There is a downside to NDAs, and that is that you can't talk about what you saw. So provided that you are prepared, to recognize that, and I'm not talking about you personally, I'm talking about a politician who is invited to look at classified information. They have to know that at the end of the day, if they've signed some sort of a NDA, that they will not be able to then use that information. Other than that, yes, if intelligence is going to be of use to you in your work and you're offered the opportunity to access it, then I would certainly avail oneself of that information or intelligence.
Thank you so much. Madame Normandin, à vous.
Ms. Normandin, you have the floor. Thank you very much. And I'd like to come back to you, Ms. McQuaid-Johnston. In your opening remarks, you said that despite the respect you had for Mr. Johnston, you were somewhat disappointed about the fact that he had not recommended a public inquiry. And in the answer you gave to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, you seem to imply that the analysis that he did of the information he received led you to believe that perhaps he wasn't familiar enough with China and that he wasn't an expert in intelligence. So in that context, I'd like you to speak to what will come next, because Mr. Johnston is going to continue really holding the reins to this, holding public hearings. Do you think that he is the right person to do this versus, say, someone who might have been agreed upon by all parliamentarians and might have different qualifications?
Well, let me give you, through you, Madam Chair, an example of what I'm talking about. The Johnston report said that he does not lack confidence in the last two elections. But surely if only one riding was adversely affected by Chinese interference, then that is a reflection of the Canadian electoral system and should never, ever happen again. And from what many of us have seen, it appears that Kenny Chew's riding was affected in that way. He lost by 3,500 votes, and there was a disinformation campaign against him. In the Johnston report, that's called misinformation, and there's a big difference. It wasn't errors, it was, frankly, lies that were told about the intention of his registry that he had proposed, including that all Chinese Canadians would be made to register, and that from there, the government could circumscribe their activities. That's not at all what a registry would do. And that's, so if he lost 3,500 votes because of that, I think that's very possible, then that's undermining our entire electoral system. And frankly, it tells the Chinese, that they can do that again because they've just been given a pass.
Thank you. Madame Blaney.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I'm actually going to come to Mr. Germain to ask a question. I think he spoke a lot about money laundering and moving money, and I think that's a particularly interesting aspect of this whole discussion. And I understand that that one of the challenges that we've been hearing repeatedly is that we may not have the appropriate legislation to address some of these key issues. So I'm just wondering, in terms of following the money trail, do we have appropriate legislation federally? Is there any need to expand that legislation? And if so, what would you recommend that looking like?
Thank you for the question. Through the chair, there are a lot of things that we can do in terms of our money laundering legislation. It's a big question. Budget 2023 did deal with some issues. The province of British Columbia has been dealing with issues. Yes, we could talk about potential changes to legislation, enforcement agencies, any number of things. But to be pertinent to this committee, on May the 11th, I spoke about the ability of the Commissioner of Elections to investigate cases of electoral interference. There is an investigative unit at the office of the election commissioner, but that office, I suggest, doesn't have the necessary tools to carry out a money laundering investigation. For example, it's my understanding they do not receive intelligence from FINTRAC, which is Canada's financial intelligence agency, due to various different restrictions. They also, as I understand, I don't believe they could obtain a wiretap, electronic eavesdropping, because Canada Elections Act offenses are not, as to my knowledge, listed as designated offenses under Part 6 of our criminal code that give rise to a wiretap. So there are these types of issues, and I would really recommend that this unit within Elections Canada, not Elections Canada, I'm sorry, the Office of the Commissioner of Elections, be not only expanded, but it's a good unit, it's got good people in there, but they need the tools and they need the resources. Thank you.
We will just do one quick question to Mr. Berthold, suivi par Mr. Turnbull, and then we'll...
Mr. Berthold, followed by Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Berthold, thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Your testimony has been very enlightening, Ms. McQuaid-Johnston. The government appears to be in reactive mode. And for 3 years ago, the government was informed of Beijing's actions, and we know that the government knew that a member had been targeted by the Beijing regime, and because of a vote in the House of Commons. Do you believe the slowness of our government's reaction has meant that today China's actions actually have had an impact on the diaspora, and now these people are afraid of speaking out because they're not defended here?
I think that could be one effect, and it's really, in my view, unconscionable that another government could be threatening a member of Parliament and his family. That this has happened is a huge surprise to most of us, and it without much broader action on China's general interference in our society, we can find more things like this happening again. They may stop that particular case, but there will be other things that they do, for example, through WeChat, where, as Mr. Johnston points out, it's controlled in the PRC. So really, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, many other countries are watching what we do in this committee and the Johnston hearings and what Canada does about this very serious foreign interference. And one of the things we may want to do is look at WeChat and suggest that working together, we could each, in our own country, have Canadian data kept on Canadian servers of WeChat, rather than having Canadian data kept in the PRC. That's something that's tangible. It's something that a public inquiry could look into and discuss with legislators the ways in which this would be done and how it would be drafted. But I don't think high-level public hearings are going to get at opportunities like that.
Thank you so much. Same amount of time to Mr. Turnbull. Floor is yours.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Ms. McCraig Johnston, I sort of have to admit that I'm a little bit concerned about a comment you made in relation to misinformation having potentially swayed as much as 3,500 votes in the last election. I don't think that, in my opinion, that you'd necessarily be in a position to really verify that it had any impact on voting behavior in the last election. We all recognize that China, even though it's difficult at times to establish where disinformation and misinformation campaigns are originating, which I think is a very commonly cited concern or challenge that security and intelligence individuals identify, right? That they say it's very tough for them to trace back to source where these are originating from. What's interesting is that there's been some really detailed research done that I've reviewed by the Media Observatory, and they've done a project on misinformation and disinformation. So these are the top experts